As we're doing this on Monday, the 10th day of November, it looks like the shutdown's going to be over soon. They got the cloture in the Senate. But what was the impact of a 40-day shutdown of government on our economy? You know, it almost seems like this was done on purpose to harm President Trump and his economic moves. To that point, let's get to it with EJ Antoni. We had you on before, EJ. Good to see you again. Heritage.org is the website. Chief Economist over at Heritage. How are you?
I'm hanging in, Joe. How about you?
I'm doing very well. You know, this is what the Democrats seem to do when you've got somebody who's on the conservative side who's running the economy. President Trump doing very well in just about every metric economically, and suddenly let's shut the government down for 40 days, make the American people think that the Republicans are in charge, so they did this, and somehow harm him and slow him down. Am I reading that right? Do you agree that they did this to hurt him?
Well, Joe, it certainly seems like that was their motivation here, and I think the reason we can surmise that they weren't negotiating in good faith, let's say, is the fact that if they really wanted to negotiate in good faith, they could have simply passed a clean CR, a clean continuing resolution, which is where everyone just says, you know what, we can't agree on what to change. So for right now, let's just keep funding everything as is. We're going to continue the current funding levels. And over the next month or 2 months, 3 months maybe, we're going to hash things out and figure out where we want to add, where we want to cut, etc. Except the Democrats didn't want to do that. And so they stalled budget negotiations for months this year in order to get us to the point where the government had to shut down. And then once the government did shut down, they were refusing to sign that CR because, again, it wasn't about negotiating in good faith for them.
Was it ever really about anything like health? It wasn't really about health care. Was it about anything other than just putting some molasses in the gears? And here's what I mean. You and I both know that the Democrats themselves put in these extra subsidies for the pandemic for the ACA, the Obamacare, and they themselves sunset it on December 31st this year. They did that. The Republicans didn't do that. The Democrats did that under Biden. So they knew that this deadline was coming up. And as you just said, 40 days ago, they could have just signed the continuing resolution. If you vote that up, then you can start negotiating about what happens with the ACA money or not. This never really was about health care, was it?
No, I mean, maybe you could say it was about healthcare insofar as they wanted to give healthcare to illegal aliens on your dime, right? They wanted the taxpayer to have to pay for that. But no, Joe, to your point, when it comes to healthcare, at the end of the day, these so-called subsidies, they're not subsidies for you and me. They're not subsidies for your viewers. These are subsidies for the health insurance companies because it's exactly like what happens with student loans. Every time we increase the amount of money kids can take out for student loans, what do schools do? They simply increase the cost of attendance to match how much kids can take out in terms of debt. And with these health insurance subsidies, every time the government decides to increase how much you can get in terms of subsidizing your health care, that's how much the health insurance companies increase their premiums or co-pays, co-insurance, etc. In other words, all of this money just passes through the customer and ends up in the pockets of the health insurance companies. One of the best things we could do to bring down the cost of health insurance is actually to get rid of all these subsidies altogether.
You know, we're not explaining that very well. You just did, but I think on a national level, they're not explaining that very well. This money that we're talking about, subsidies to the insurance companies, and you're absolutely right, this was added because of the pandemic, and it was supposed to not be permanent. So why can't we just let it go away?
Well, Joe, look at how many different these so-called COVID measures never went away, right? Yeah. I mean, it was 2 weeks to slow the spread, right? And then 2 years later, we still had all these different measures in place. And here we are now 5 years later, and we're still fighting to try to eliminate so much of this absolute nonsense. Look at what happened with food stamps, the exact same thing. We not only increased how much people could get on food stamps, increased it pretty dramatically, but we also effectively reduced the requirements. In other words, we made it easier for folks who previously could not have gotten food stamps for all of them to get it as well. So the result was not only an explosion in the number of people on the program, but also a great increase in how much each individual could get. Hence, there was a tremendous explosion in the overall expenditures of the program. It's just one of many examples of all of these changes we made the last few years, which were done under the auspices of trying to help the less fortunate or those struggling, whatever the case may be. And in fact, it has done exactly the opposite. It has just continued to trap millions of Americans into cycles of dependency.
Chief economist over at heritage.org. It's EJ Antoni. We appreciate the time and the access. We added about $2 trillion to our spending annually because of the pandemic. That was supposed to go away. We're having a tug of war fight just to get rid of 250 million, or 250 billion, I should say. We're not getting rid of 2 trillion where we really should. Is there a mechanism that you can explain to my audience and to me, EJ, where the government can, in fact, reel all of that money back in? Because rescission was only $8 or $9 billion. It's a lot of money. That's nothing compared to $2 trillion. And then we had the big, beautiful bill that cut, half a billion or half a trillion, something like that, maybe on the high end. How do you get rid of $2 trillion in extra spending that was supposed to be temporary? Is there a governmental mechanism that can be used right now by Trump in the executive or by the legislature or whatever?
Well, Joe, going through regular order. In other words, not passing these constant bloated omnibus bills, right, that they're sometimes called, but go through regular order, pass individual budgets for individual departments and agencies, et cetera, and essentially do the way you approach that, Joe, is to say, all right, we're going to assume this agency or this department, whatever the case may be, needs $0. Justify for us, agency, department, whatever, justify for us every single dollar in spending that you need. So we're not just going to assume that you get the same budget you did last year. The budget's filled with abuse, with corruption, with fraud, with waste. That's what Doge taught us very explicitly. So make everyone justify every dollar they get from the taxpayer. And I think that's a good, solid way to start cutting year after year and to very quickly get to the $2 trillion in cuts that you need. It'll basically get you back to pre-pandemic spending levels, which will balance the budget.
How long have we been doing these omnibuses and minibuses and the in-between buses? When's the last time we did the 12 individual issues that they're supposed to be deciding as far as budget goes? Has it been a very long time since we've done that?
Well, it's been a good number of years, but Joe, it's not as if you have to go back to the early post-war era or the Civil War era. It's nothing like that. I mean, you can go back to the 1990s, for example, and you can see what a great job they did with budgeting back then. That wasn't that long ago, and they did such a good job with the budget back then, and it was bipartisan. You had Republicans in Congress, you had a Democrat in the White House, but they did such a good job working together that they actually reduced spending below tax receipts. And we had a surplus. Think of that, a surplus well into the 90s. So this idea that somehow we've gotten so far into the hole that we can never dig out, or that the budget has gotten so big that we can never cut it back down to size. I mean, again, you literally only have to go back 5 or 6 years to find a spending level that would actually balance the budget today. That's how much the economy has grown. That's how much tax receipts have grown.
Amazing. So we can still do it. The problem is they've gained millions and millions of people on so-called entitlements who don't want to give it up. When we were talking about losing SNAP, when you're talking about something with the ACA, people immediately said, what about mine? What about me? Why are you taking it away from me? Like Mamdani just won in New York because he said, what do you want? And then he said what they wanted in the campaign trail. Is he actually going to do it? Probably not. But he said exactly what they wanted, and everybody's looking very individualistic into what they're getting from the government. How dare you take it away from me? So how do we change that mindset economically and say, you guys in this economy, you can go get a great job. You can go and fend for yourself, learn how to fish instead of taking a fish. How do we turn a mindset that is now reliant on government, which is what the far left wanted it to be the entire time?
Well, I think you're unfortunately just going to have to force people to learn some very hard lessons. In other words, look at SNAP that we were just talking about, Joe. It's actually just over a third of the people on that program are able-bodied adults. So we're not talking about people who are disabled. They're able-bodied adults and they're not working. That's inexcusable. We need to go back to having work requirements for these different programs, and we need to structure them in such a way that you don't have these so-called cliffs when it comes to income. In other words, if you start earning just a little bit of money, what happens? You lose all of your welfare benefits. And so if you go from earning nothing to maybe earning $20,000 or $30,000 and you lose $40,000 in benefits, you've essentially lost money, right? So that's why a lot of people choose to never go down that route. So restructure the program so that you eliminate those cliffs, and at the same time, go back to having work requirements. Again, it's inexcusable that people who are able-bodied adults are not out there working or not contributing to society. It is high time that all of the hardworking taxpayers in this country make their voices known and make sure that politicians know that they are angry that they have fellow Americans effectively stealing from them by being on these welfare programs when they could be out working and being productive members of society.
EJ Antoni, PhD. I brought up Mamdani. He's talking about raising taxes on business owners and so-called billionaires and millionaires by 2%. You know, he's not going to stop there. He's going to raise taxes on everybody. Already people are flooding the markets in Florida, here in Texas, as far as moving there, bringing their businesses there. There are a lot of people making a hard decision in New York City. What can he actually do legally and get away with as far as this democratic socialism that he talks about? He's a socialist. He's really basically a communist. He's already on day one or day two threatened to the city's just going to take over buildings from landlords if they want. What do you do about a guy like this who clearly is not capitalist and he's clearly against the society that we built here in this country economically?
Well, you leave. In short, I mean that's the pithy answer, right? Exactly. I mean, Joe, I did a study back in 2021 where I looked at what was at the time the latest tax increase in New York, and what I found was essentially over the course of the coming decade, 1 million extra people were going to leave the state, and that's on top of what was an existing out-migration trend where people were moving to Texas, where you are, to Tennessee, to Florida, mostly to zero-income tax states. Right. In other words, these tax increases only accelerated the problem. It's exactly what's going to happen yet again if he starts implementing his big spending, big taxing, and big regulatory agenda in New York City.
Does the federal government have leverage on him? Is there any money from the federal government that goes to New York City directly, or does it go to the state of New York and then the state of New York divvies it out however they want? Is there economic leverage that Trump can bring?
Oh, certainly. And there's both of those funding mechanisms, Joe. You have some instances where it will go directly to the 5 boroughs, other instances where it goes to the state of New York. But whatever the case may be, we've seen this with Secretary Duffy in the Department of Transportation, where he has threatened multiple times to withhold funding to different cities or different states because they are violating federal statutes. And I think that the president is going to need every tool at his disposal, including the Justice Department, to try to hold the unconstitutional activities of this communist at bay over the coming years.
Can you compare and contrast the economy? I'm switching gears a lot because I love your knowledge. It's EJ Antoni. Can you compare and contrast 1 year ago today to Biden's economy and Trump's economy? Even with the 40-day shutdown, the economy feels better to me, but I know some people are saying that, well, the prices didn't come down as much as they wanted and affordability, this and that. Where are we economically if we just compare apples to apples?
Well, Joe, we're certainly better, but the thing is, we're starting from so far behind, right? We spent 4 years where the economy essentially went backwards. And I understand the stock market went up, but that doesn't mean that people could afford a home. Doesn't mean that people could pay their utility bills, could buy food, etc. Doesn't mean that people could afford a car. Instead, people were drowning in credit card debt at 30% interest rates, for crying out loud.
Nuts.
So again, if you look at, I think, a metric that really matters to folks, like what can the average American buy with his or her weekly paycheck? That fell about 4% from when Biden took office to when he left office. Now, what has it done under Trump? It's up about 1%. So again, we're moving in the right direction, but I think we need to appreciate just how far behind we were at the start. In other words, Trump is essentially, and you could think of it as he's starting a race after the gun has already gone off and everyone's already a lap around the track. And he's got to make up for a lot of lost ground. So yes, we're moving in the right direction. Yes, things are turning around very quickly. But we have to, I think, sympathize with the American people here who are still financially hurting because they got so beat up for 4 years. You spent 4 years going into credit card debt. You don't have it all paid off in a year. You had 4 years where prices were rising faster than your wages. Just because you have 1 year of wages rising faster than prices doesn't mean you're back to where you were in 2019 or 2020. So again, I think we should still have a healthy appreciation for the fact that so many millions of Americans are hurting right now. Are they hurting less than they were a year ago? Yes, but they're still hurting.
We've got about a year to make sure that people understand. If you give the Congress to the Democrats, all of it stops. Any improvement that we've made has stopped. His policies won't be able to go forward. He can do executive orders, but they'll be gone if you get a Democrat in office 2 years after that. But the midterm is going to really be vital when it comes to the economy, is it not? I mean, either he can do what he planned on doing, which is going to take 4 full years, or he's going to have to stop after 2 years like last time.
Yeah, Joe, that's going to be a big problem, I think. The Democrats will probably do exactly what they did during his first term, which is as soon as they regain control, just block him at every chance they can. They'll drag him down with impeachment proceedings, even though they were completely illegitimate, which is what we saw last time. So I agree. If he's going to win, and this is. I'm a monetary scientist, not a political scientist. So, take all this with a grain of salt. But as far as I can tell, if the economy does not improve significantly when the midterms roll around, that's going to be disastrous. Now, I think it is going to continue improving. So there's good news there. But I think the president also needs to focus more on domestic issues, chiefly the economy, and stop worrying about foreign affairs. Let the rest of the world police itself. Let the rest of the world take care of its own problems. If it's not in our backyard, I think the administration needs to stop worrying about it. It needs to really get hyper focused in on the economy and making people's lives financially better.
From the Heritage Foundation, EJ Antoni, we appreciate the time and the access. Last question. This thing just came out yesterday. President Trump talking about $2,000 to all Americans, not the wealthy ones, but everybody else could get a $2,000 check from the tariffs. Does that make sense to you?
I'd like to see another idea that he has talked about quite a bit, which is this idea of why don't we just take all this tariff revenue and pay down the debt, or at least put it into the general fund so that we don't have to borrow as much each year.
Yes.
One of the key things that Americans are having to fight with right now is the size of the deficit. In other words, government is borrowing so much money, they're taking up so much of the loanable funds market that there's not much left for everybody else.
Right.
And so you and I have to compete with the federal government. Well, that's not a fight we can win. So there's not as much money for us to borrow, which drives up interest on mortgage rates. It drives up interest on auto loans, student loans, you name it, credit cards. So if you really want to help the American people, if you want to help reduce their financing costs and make life more affordable for them, one of the best things you can do is reduce government borrowing.
Yeah, but EJ, you'd have to really sell that well. We're not going to send you $2,000, but it's really cool. We're going to pay down the debt, and everybody, in every street USA is going to go, yeah, but I'd rather have a check. I mean, we've gotten drunk on that, I think. So I know that you're right, and I agree with you, but give me about 20 seconds. How do you sell that to the American people? Instead of a check, we're going to pay down the debt.
Well, what happened in 2020, 2021, 2022, the government sent out a lot of checks. And yeah, that felt good for a little bit until all of your prices rose as a consequence of that.
Yeah, you couldn't afford eggs.
Right. It's much like alcoholism, right? The buzz feels great at first, and then the hangover is pretty terrible the next day. That's what these government checks are.
Very good point. EJ Antoni, go to heritage.org. We really appreciate the time and the knowledge, EJ. Come back again soon, okay?
My pleasure, Joe. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate you. We're back after this. Stay right here.